great pleasure for me to introduce our next two speakers. So I'm going to try not to get emotional about this. As Dr. Harlan said, I think we're both quite fond of both of these women. We have Chef RD Emily Schlag, who came on as our third hire at the Goldring Center for Culinary Medicine, and has now gone on and moved on to be the RD and manager of the Culinary Medicine program at St. Barnabas Hospital in the Bronx. She's going to lead us through an amazing knife skills demo and cook-along, all from her tiny apartment in Manhattan. So it just goes to show us how we can, really meet people where they are and do amazing things, no matter what type of space or barrier that we have with a little creative thinking and planning. So I'm so excited to have Emily here with us today, alongside chef and newly minted RD, Heather Nace. Heather took over as Director of Operations and Executive Chef of the Goldring Center for Culinary Medicine. And through this year of stepping into a new job, as well as leading the kitchen through a pandemic, she also finished her dietetic internship and became a registered dietitian just a few weeks ago. So we're so happy to have Heather and Emily there. I'm going to stop gushing and I'm going to turn it over to Emily and Heather.
Thanks, Carrie. So welcome, everybody. Like Carrie said, we have a knife skills demo for you all. So if you're cooking along, just know that I do have a few things that I Magic of TV cooked already, which is just our shrimp and rice noodles, but we'll get to those later. So today we're going to be covering some advanced knife skills. And if we can go to the next slide. So after participating in this session, hopefully you should be confident and able to describe and also execute techniques for cutting a variety of produce. You should also be able to fabricate, which just means cut cuts of meat and seafood, and hopefully you will also be able to integrate these knife skills and some safety techniques that we'll be covering in order to promote patient confidence in the kitchen. Next slide. So why learn knife skills? Why is this part of the Culinary Medicine Conference? Well, having good knife skills is going to increase your kitchen confidence. You're also going to improve your speed and efficiency in the kitchen, which is great because we're all busy people. We want to save time wherever we can. We also want to ensure that we are safe in the kitchen and encounter less cuts, scrapes, and burns. And when you combine all of these things together, you're just going to have more fun in the kitchen. And if you're someone that is anxious around cooking, hopefully these good knife skills will lessen any anxiety in the kitchen as well. Next slide. So there are a few essential knife cuts that we will be covering today. If you can master these knife cuts, you can pretty much cut up anything. Even if there's something that I'm not showing you today, you master these. We throw any vegetable your way, you're going to be able to cut it up. So the first is a chop. And this is just where we're cutting something into roughly the same size, but not necessarily the same shape. And that's going to be a little bit different from a dice, where we want everything to be the same size, but we also want it to be the same shape. Generally, with a dice, our food is going to end up as a cube. And the size of our dice can vary a lot. Sometimes we will call for a small dice or a brunoise, or we might call for a medium or a large dice. So you always want to check for that on your recipe. We also have a julienne, which is just where we're cutting something into long, thin strips. And just like our dice, oftentimes your recipe will tell you what size julienne we're looking for. Then we have a mince, and the mince is very similar to the chop, but it's just going to be a lot smaller. So we're not looking for uniform size here. We just want to make that product as small as possible. And then finally, we have a chiffonade. A chiffonade is very similar to a julienne because our end product is going to be in long, thin strips, but this is just a different technique for herbs and leafy greens. It's just a method of rolling those up and slicing them to make those long, thin strips. Next slide. So a few things that we want to consider before we just start hacking away at things. You have to think about, will this ingredient be raw or cooked? If we're cooking ingredients, they soften, they become easier to eat and bite through. So generally when we cook things, they're going to be a little bit bigger. If something is going to be raw, for example, raw carrots or cucumber on a salad, we want to think about, how easily can I bite through this? So generally for those raw ingredients, we make them thinner or smaller so they're easier for us to eat. We also want to think about, are we cooking this ingredient with other ingredients? So if I have some peppers and onions that I'm going to be cooking together, I want to make sure that I'm cutting those peppers and onions the same size so that they cook at the same rate. That also goes for something like a pico de gallo. Eating this food. Is it a spoon that we'll be using? Are we using a fork, a knife and fork? Is it going to be something that we eat with our hands? We want to think about that so we can anticipate what is going to be easiest to pick up with our utensil. And then finally, when does this go into our recipe? Are our onions going in way at the beginning for a long 4-hour braise? Then we can probably cut them a little bit bigger because they're going to have a lot of time to cook down. But if our ingredient is just being added at the very end of cooking, generally we want to cut that smaller so that it cooks faster and we don't ruin our recipe by having to extend the cooking time. Next slide. So it's just helpful to know the anatomy of a knife because in some recipes we will refer to certain parts of the knife, and it's just nice to know what we're talking about when we're talking about how to hold your knife or different knife cuts. So the two main parts of the knife are going to be our blade and our handle. Obviously the handle is the part that we are holding onto. In between the blade and the handle, there's a thicker section known as the bolster. And this will make sense in a few minutes when I show you how we actually hold our knife, but the bolster is kind of, what we hold onto. When it comes to our blade, the sharp edge is known as the cutting edge. And on the cutting edge, we have the heel of the knife, which is closer to the handle. That is generally a thicker portion of the blade. It has a little more heft to it. So if we're chopping through something that's very hard, like a sweet potato, we generally focus on using the heel of the blade for that. On the other end of the blade, we have the tip of our cutting edge. The tip is going to be helpful if we have some more precise slicing that we need to do, or oftentimes because we use the middle of our cutting edge when we're chopping, the tip ends up retaining its sharpness a little bit better. So my little trick is if something's not quite working, I need to cut through something. Generally, if I use the tip of the knife, it's a little bit sharper. Next slide. So there are a lot of different types of knives, and I don't know if y'all can see my cutting board right now, but I will show you a variety of knives before we get started. You don't need 10, 20 knives in your arsenal when you get started. The most important knife that you need is a chef's knife. And there's two main types of knives that you'll see people use. So on this screen on the top left, you will see what we generally just refer to as a plain old chef's knife. This is actually a a European or French style chef's knife. This is probably what most of you are the most familiar with. We also have a Santoku knife, which is on the right on the top of your screen. This has a different shape to it, and you can see that the top of the blade is a little more curved and the tip is pointed downwards, whereas on the chef's knife, the tip is pointing outwards. Whichever one you like to use is up to you, but just know that we will use the chef's knife for, I would say, 90% of our cutting tasks. So this is the most important knife for you. And then we have a paring knife. Pretty important, but not the most important knife. This is just a very, very small knife, and we will use this for more precise tasks. So you'll see me later on using my paring knife to take the hull or the stem out of strawberries. We'll also use that paring knife to devein our shrimp. Then we have a serrated knife. So we usually think of serrated knives as being for cutting bread, but we can also use those serrated knives for cutting through fruits and vegetables with delicate or very tough skins. So tomatoes, for example, are notoriously kind of hard to slice through. So sometimes we'll switch to a serrated knife. It's a little easier to cut through those tomato skins. Or if we have something like a pineapple with a really tough skin, we don't want to ruin our nice knife cutting through that skin, we can shave that skin of the pineapple off with the serrated knife. And then we have a boning knife. This is not as important of a knife unless you plan on fabricating your own cuts of meat. So if you like to buy whole chickens or whole pieces of meat and break them down yourself, having a boning knife would be very useful to you. They're generally about 7 inches long, and they're just going to be much, much thinner than a chef's knife. And that pretty much allows us to kind of contour the knife around the different cuts of meat, around the bone within meat. And it just makes things a little bit easier, a little bit more delicate when we're breaking down cuts of meat. Next slide. So when we're caring for our knives, there are a few essential do's and don'ts. Number one don't, and if you've ever taken a cooking class with us, you should know this, but please do not wash your knife in the dishwasher. Certain types of metals that might be used for a knife can actually rust. Oftentimes our knives are stainless steel, so that's not much of an issue, but you will dull the blade of your knife. You could also ruin the handle of your knife by running it through the dishwasher. So instead, we want to keep our knives clean and dry, and we want to always, always, always hand wash our knives. And when we're hand washing our knives, it's important to avoid abrasive sponges. So if you have the traditional yellow and green sponge, where the green is that kind of rougher, coarser side, use the yellow, softer side of your sponge to wash your knife. And I highly recommend drying your knife right away after you've finished washing it. You also want to make sure that you don't store your knives uncovered and loose in a drawer. And I am guilty of this. I definitely did this in college. I had my scary knife drawer that was very unsafe. Please don't do that, especially if your knives are uncovered, because having your knives rattling around in a drawer could also cause them to lose their sharp edge. So if your cutting edge is rubbing up against another knife or the side of your drawer, it's just going to get dull in there. That's also a safety hazard. So instead, store your knives on either a magnetic strip, which look really nice in your kitchen, or in a knife block. Or if neither of those are an option for you, you can store your knives in a drawer. Just make sure you have a protective sheath over them. And then finally, don't use your knives on a glass cutting board. This is like a new concept to me. I've never used glass cutting boards before, but I do know that they are fairly popular. The glass is harder than the steel of your blade, which means that when you are chopping on that cutting board, something needs to absorb the shock. Because your knife is softer than the cutting board, your knife is absorbing that shock, and it's going to get duller faster. So instead, we want to use cutting boards that are softer than our knives. It's okay for your cutting boards to get, cuts and scrapes in them. that means that they're doing their job. So use things like plastic, wood, or bamboo for your cutting boards. Save the nice, beautiful glass cutting boards for a cheese or charcuterie board. Next slide. So knife sharpening. Knife sharpening is very important. I always like to say a sharp knife is going to be much safer than a dull knife. So we want to keep our knives sharp. When we sharpen our knives, a portion of the cutting edge is actually ground away to make a new, sharper edge. So metal is basically being shaved off of your knife when it's being sharpened. For general home cooks, you really only need to sharpen your knives once or twice a year. Now, we can sharpen knives ourselves on something known as a whetstone, but they are pretty tricky to use. You have to practice a lot. It's honestly pretty easy to mess up the blade of your knife. I've messed up knives before, and I learned how to sharpen my knives in culinary school. So for most home cooks, I recommend just taking your knives to a professional to get them sharpened. It's not very expensive. They will do a good job, and you only need to go once or twice a year. Next slide. So something that goes along with sharpening is going to be honing. And honing is something that we often refer to as sharpening, but honing actually doesn't sharpen our knife. So if we were to look at the cutting edge of our knife, it comes to a very, very, very small, fine point that we can barely see. And when we use our knife, basically the very, very edge of our cutting edge will get bends or nicks or folds every time that we use it. When the cutting edge folds over, our knife then seems like it's dull. So what do? We use a honing steel, which you can see in the picture here. If you've ever bought like a 10-piece knife set or a knife block before, it's probably come with a honing steel. So when we use the honing steel, we're not sharpening the blade. We're not taking metal off of the blade. We're just realigning that cutting edge. We're getting rid of those bends and folds in our blade in order to make it seem like it's sharp again, but really we're just realigning that cutting edge that was still sharp. So the best practice is to hone your knife before each use. For a general home cook, I would say if you can hone your knife, once or twice per week, that's going to be good enough for you. Next slide. So we're going to transition very soon into the demo. I just wanted to give you all an overview of the menu. So we will be doing some roast chicken legs with potatoes, cauliflower, and olives. We're also going to make some pickled red onions, some pico de gallo. We'll make some spring rolls with some shrimp. And then we're going to make a dipping sauce for those spring rolls called nukjum. Next slide. So I believe that you should all be able to see my cutting board right now. So I just want to give you all, general overview of what our station should look like before we get started. So on our cutting board, I recommend if you're in the market for a new cutting board, getting something that has these rubber kind of grips on it. This is going to keep my cutting board from moving if I push on it. If your cutting board is slip sliding all over the place while you're trying to chop something, that is going to be a safety hazard. If you don't have a cutting board with these grips on it, you can also take a wet paper towel or a damp cloth and just put that under your cutting board to prevent it from slipping. At our cutting board as well, I recommend having some kind of bowl that you can put your trash and scraps into. Another thing that is very useful is a bench scraper, and I will get into how to use these in a little bit, but these are basically used for picking up cut product and moving them somewhere else. You also want to have some, handy bowls on standby for putting your cut products into. We refer to these as mise en place bowls. Mise en place is a French term meaning everything in its place. This is how we stay organized in the kitchen. If you need it, I also recommend having, some kind of towel handy and nearby just in case there's a spill or something you need to clean up. Then we have our knives. So I have a couple knives on display for you all here. Starting on the right, we have our Santoku knife. This is my personal preferred knife to use. I like the Santoku knives specifically because the point of the knife is pointing downwards. I have just poked myself too many times with the tip of a chef's knife, so I just prefer to use those Santoku knives. This one is about 7 inches long. I find that a nice length for the blade. I believe they come in different sizes, but 7 is going to be the standard for our Santoku knife. We also have a knife that I forgot to put out. We have 2 chef's knives here. So, and you can see that these both are different sizes. So these are 2 different chef's knives. The one on the left here is a German style chef's knife, whereas the one on the right is a Japanese style chef's knife. The main difference being the angle of our cutting edge, which I can get into in the Q&A section if you want me to, but just know that Japanese style knives tend to be thinner, a little sharper. The German style chef's knives tend to be a little bit thicker, and I like to use them more for heavy duty work. So for our knives, you can see we have different lengths. The one on the left here, I believe, is 10 inches long, whereas the one on the right is 8 inches long. I find that 10 inches is a bit too long for a chef's knife for me personally, but I do keep this knife around just for, some heavy duty work. So I'm actually going to use this when I'm cutting up my chicken later. Then we have our boning knife. So you can see that this is much thinner than our chef's knife. This is going to be really nice, like I said, for more delicate work where we kind of have to, trim around muscle and bone and tendons in our meat. It's also helpful if we're filleting something like a fish. Then we have our paring knife. They're small, generally about 3 inches long. They're great for, our more precise, delicate work. Then for our serrated knife, might be a little hard to tell it's serrated on the camera here. So this is a very small serrated knife. This is actually not really great for using, for trying to cut up bread, but this knife is really great if I need to cut up tomatoes and my knives are dull, or if I'm cutting up pineapple, like I mentioned earlier. And then this is something that might often be referred to as a utility knife. It looks like a chef's knife, it's just smaller, it's about 5 inches long. Some people just prefer to use smaller knives, or if whatever you're cutting, isn't very big, you're not doing a lot of chopping, the utility knife can be helpful. And you can see that this knife does have a protective sheath that came with it. So I can go ahead and store this knife in a drawer without worrying that it's going to dull. And then just another extra thing that's helpful is having a good pair of kitchen shears. They don't need to be expensive. Honestly, the pair of kitchen shears I normally work with, I got from the dollar store like 6 years ago, and they're still holding up strong. So just get some kitchen shears. They serve so many purposes. So I'm going to clear some of these knives away and show you all really quickly how to actually hone our knife. All right, so when we are honing our knife, we have our honing steel here. There are 2 different types of honing blades. Some will have ridges on them, and you might also find a diamond steel or ceramic steel. The ceramic steels and the diamond steels do technically shave off a little bit of metal on your knife. So they do seem like they sharpen your knife a little bit, but it's never going to be to the extent that using a whetstone or a professional sharpener will use. So the honing steel that I am using today is a diamond steel honing steel. And I'm just going to show you on my Santoku knife how we're going to use this. So some of you might have one of these already. Again, if you ever bought like a 10-piece knife set or a knife block that came with knives in it, there's usually like a holding place for these steels. So when we're using our steel, I'm going to use a technique that you've probably never seen before because all of the chefs on TV, or if you ever watch, any kind of cooking video, they're holding their steel up like this, and they're kind of running their knife along like this, and everything's happening in the air. I don't like doing this. My knife is going towards my arm, which isn't great, and I have nothing to rest my steel against. So instead, what I like to do is stand my honing steel up straight. And ideally, you want to rest this on a towel, or in my case, I'm resting it on the rubber grip of my cutting board. I'm doing this because if I were to just go on my cutting board, it is kind of slippery. I don't want to slip. I want to have a good grip on this. Now, with our blade, when we run it against our honing steel, you want to have about a 15 to 20 degree angle between your blade and the steel. So if you have too small of an angle, you're just not going to do anything. And if your angle is too wide, you might actually make your knife worse. So a good rule of thumb is to imagine 2 pennies between the top of your blade and the honing steel. That's going to be about that 15 to 20 degree angle. Now, when I am honing my knife, I want to hone the entire length of my blade, and I want to use the entire length of my honing steel. So I'm going to do this from the side just so you all can see, but I'm going to start with the heel of my blade at the top of my honing steel. Often you might angle your knife upwards, and I'm just going to pull down and towards me at the same time. And when you're honing, you want to switch back and forth each time between the sides of your blade. That way you will evenly hone your blade. So when I do the next side, again, I start at the top and pull towards myself when I'm honing. So you can see from the side, I get the whole length of my blade when I'm honing. And you only need to pass your knife over the honing blade 4 or 5 times. You don't need to go crazy with it. It shouldn't take you a long time, which is why it's nice to try to get into the habit of honing your blade before each time that you cook. And if you have a diamond steel, something that I always like to do is just run my finger or a towel over the blade. There will actually be some of that steel that got rubbed off left over on the blade of your knife. So it's just nice to wipe that off in some way before you get started cooking. So next we are going to get into how to cut up a chicken.
Hey, Emily, before you start the chicken, can I ask you a question that came in from the audience here? So one of our participants wants to know how do you feel about those handheld sharpeners? And I think we're talking about those little guys that you kind of like run the knife through. Is that actually sharpening, or is it just honing?
Those, I believe, do sharpen your knife. They kind of serve the same purpose. So if you buy a whetstone, there's different grits. So a lower grit will take off more steel, but it doesn't leave as sharp as the surface. Whereas the higher grit is more of like a finishing surface, doesn't take off as much steel, but will give you a really nice, smooth, sharp cutting edge. So I personally don't have one of the handheld sharpeners, but they will work to sharpen your knife. I don't think that they would work as well as bringing them to a professional, but they're not expensive. They can be something handy to keep at home.
We also had a question about the honing steels and whether they're universal and can be used on both Japanese and German knives.
They can. Yep. So you can use it on either knife. If you have a Japanese knife, I recommend looking into the angle of your blade. Basically, I don't know what's in view right now, but basically for the angle of our blade on a German knife, it's equal on both sides, whereas on a Japanese knife, one side is a little, has a smaller angle than the other side. So that's just something to keep in mind, that your angle does change with a Japanese knife. which is actually how I kind of ruined the edge of my Japanese knife and now has a German edge. Still sharp, it still works fine.
Last question about this. How much pressure would you describe that you apply when you're actually running it over the honing steel?
Very little pressure.
Okay.
So you can kind of hear from the sound. I don't know if the sound is picking up on my headphones, but you just want this kind of nice tinny sound. If you're pressing too hard, that sound is going to change. It is a deeper sound, and you just don't want to press too hard. You really don't want to ruin the blade of your knife.
Last thing that just came through real quick about serrated knives being sharpened. I think that the best way to do those is to take them to a professional. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, serrated knives are hard to sharpen. Honestly, the advice I've always been given is buy a cheap serrated knife. Once it's dull, just get a new one. I think they can be sharpened, but it's not something you can really do at home.
Yeah, agreed. All right, let's do chicken.
All right, let's cut this chicken. All right, so I believe you all should be able to see my cutting board now. So I have my chicken here, and Heather's going to talk a little bit about, methods of buying chicken in a few minutes. So this chicken is exactly how it came out of the bag. I haven't touched it yet. So if you've never bought a whole chicken before, the first thing you should always do is check the inside cavity. You're going to have some fun treats in there. So this is our giblets. Dr. Harlan corrected me on my pronunciation of that word last week. Within here, you just have some internal organs. The neck is also going to be in here. So definitely save these. You can cook up that organ meat. And I also like to save the neck to make stock with. So all of my scraps I'm going to put off to the side. None of our chicken will be wasted. We are going to use this whole bird, which is a great, reason to buy a whole chicken. So if we look in our chicken, there's nothing else inside. We have the breast on top. We have our wings here. And then we have our legs. And on our legs, we have our our drumstick and our thigh. And if we turn our chicken over, we have the backbone. So you can see I have my chicken resting on some paper towels. We don't need to wash our chicken, but I do like to pat it dry because when our chicken is wet, it does feel a little bit slimy, and it's just harder to hold on to. So we're going to break this chicken down into 8 pieces. There's a couple different ways to break down a chicken that will yield you with different results. I find that this method that I'm going to be showing you all today is the most kind of useful for a lot of different recipes. So we are going to start by removing the legs. So we have our legs here. We see that we have this skin that's tight and kind of in our way. So I'm just going to take my boning knife to just use the tip of my knife and kind of pierce through that skin so I can start to see the difference between my chicken leg and the chicken breast. And if you want to as well, now is a time when we can trim off this excess skin and fat if we want to. You don't really need to spend a lot of time on this. And again, I save the skin for my stock. I think it adds good flavor. You can always skim the melted fat off at the end. Okay, so we have our chicken here, and we can see our legs a lot better now. So what I want to do is, again, just kind of cut through anything that's in my way. And I'm going to start by removing the whole leg from the body. So when we do this, chicken hips are somewhat similar to our own hips, and we can go ahead and we're just going to pull this apart, and you should break that hip joint and be able to actually see some bone on your chicken here. So now what I want to do is just cut the leg off. So this might be a little tricky to see on camera, but basically I hold my thigh up in the air so I can use the body weight of the chicken as kind of something to pull those pieces apart. Another thing to note on the back of the chicken here, this round section that kind of sticks out is nice and tender. It's referred to as the oyster of the chicken. So we have 2 oysters on the thigh. You do want to try to preserve that oyster meat. So another good reason to kind of hold our chicken up. So I'm going to use my boning knife to start cutting towards the hip joint. And if you do it right, you should just be able to cut through the whole thing, just like that. You do want to try to preserve as much meat on the thighs as possible. I didn't do the best job here because I was looking at my computer screen, but I do have a little bit of meat left here. That's fine. Again, we're not wasting any of this chicken. I'm saving the backbone for making chicken soup or chicken stock. So we still have a decent amount of meat left on our leg. So let's do the other leg. Again, I have this kind of excess skin right here. I just like to kind of poke through that. Makes my life a lot easier. So again, I'm going to break that hip joint and we can start to see this bone actually popping out. I'm going to hold my chicken up and I start cutting near the top of the chicken. So I'm just going to slice through, trying to preserve as much meat as possible. We have our joint right here. So I just cut through between the bone and that socket, and then I just keep cutting down until I get that whole leg. So now we have the breast left and the wings left. So I am going to take the wings off of the breast now. The wing tips don't really have a lot of meat on them, so generally we do take these off. They just have a tendency to burn when we try to cook them. So to take the wing off, we can kind of break this joint if we need to, but this is a joint that we can actually just cut through. And a trick for cutting through the joints of chicken is if you're cutting and you hit bone and it's not going through, then you just need to adjust where your knife is until you are no longer cutting bone. You shouldn't have to cut through bone when we're taking apart the joints. So I'm going to save these wing tips for my scraps. So I do like to kind of reveal that joint, see where that joint kind of is, where it bends, and just cut through the middle of that to get my wing tip. Now I'm going to remove the wings from the shoulder. So I will admit this is my least favorite part of doing the chicken, but basically we have this kind of bend right here. So I'm going to come in with my knife basically in the armpit of the chicken. So I'm just going to start cutting until I reach that joint, and you should be able to cut through the joint. This is not like the hip bone where you need to break it. You can just cut all the way through it. So if we, just want to show you all, this is that kind of shoulder piece. So it is open now because I started cutting through it, but I can just cut through the rest of the way to get that wing. So now I'm going to do the other side. And again, I'm using the weight of the chicken to pull this apart. So I don't have to pull it apart with my hands. The chicken is helping me. So again, I'm going to kind of come in through the armpit of that chicken, cut through that joint. This one I found a lot quicker. And then you just keep going around that wing. Now you could separate these wings if you want to. I'm actually going to roast these with my chicken legs later. I like to leave them whole personally. If you wanted to take them apart, it's just like taking the wing tip off of the wing. All right, so now all we have left is our breast, and it's still attached to this backbone. So some people do just like to kind of pull up, break the backbone, and rip it off. What I actually like to do instead, I'm gonna dry my hands off because we're getting a little slimy over here. What I like to do instead is actually take some kitchen shears, and we're gonna cut through the ribs on our chicken. The ribs are very small, they're super easy to cut through. So I'm just gonna cut up the backbone through those ribs all the way up. So you can see, very easy to do that. And I'm just going to repeat on the opposite side.
Emily, I love using the scissors for this. I do the same thing, and I think you probably do too, for like a spatchcocked chicken, where
Yes.
you open it up and roast it flat. And the scissors are so easy to do that.
Yeah, so spatchcocking a chicken, like Heather said, we take the backbone out and we kind of flatten the chicken. And it's just a quicker way to roast a whole chicken. So now we have our backbone. You can see these ribs that I cut through. I'm going to save this for stock. This is precious. Do not throw away the backbone. Like someone's grandmother is going to come for you if you do. So I have my whole breast. You could roast this if you wanted to. I have my legs still. So now I want to separate the two breast pieces. I also want to separate my two leg pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and move over to a cutting board. We're going to start with the breast. So I'm doing a bone-in breast. You don't have to if you don't want to, but I like leaving the bones in the breast, and my camera is a little fuzzy. Sorry, guys. I like leaving the bones in the breast. Heather will talk about why in a few minutes. But to separate these two pieces, we have the keel or the sternum of the chicken. So we can cut through this. It's a little hard to do, but you can do it. So I start by making just a cut into that bone right here, just to separate that out. Then what I do is I flip this over, and I'm going to use my body weight to flatten that chicken. And that helps that bone to just pop apart a little more evenly. Words are hard, you guys. So this is kind of breaking apart on its own, not super evenly. We can see that part of this bone here just wants to stay on the left side. That's fine. We're still going to just cut through the heel. So you can see I'm just using the heel of my hand on the top of my blade as just some leverage to be able to cut through this. And then I'm going to use a sawing motion to start to separate these pieces apart. Now you are going to run into the wishbone. I did not take that out, but the wishbone does break pretty easily. And you should just be able to continue cutting through that piece of chicken. So somewhere in here, right here, we can see we still will have the wishbone. It's fine to cook that chicken with these bones in. They're going to be a lot tastier that way. So we have our two bone-in breasts. We have our two chicken wings. So we're up to 4 pieces of chicken right now. Now I want to separate my drumsticks from my thighs. I'm going to show you all how to do this, skin on and skin off. I find it personally a little bit easier to do with the skin off. But if we look at our leg, we can see that there's a seam right here where there's a color difference between the two pieces. That seam tells us where to cut. A lot of people will say, oh, bend the chicken to find the joint. I find that very hard to do. So I instead look for the seam. And actually, if we flip our chicken over to kind of pull that skin away, you'll see a fat line it's a little tricky to see on this piece, but we'll see a fat line right here. That also tells us where to cut. So I'm going to just use my chef's knife for this again. I look for that seam on the chicken, and that's where I'm going to cut. And I'm cutting, I'm hitting bone, so I know to adjust where my knife is. So I'm just going to switch and move my knife a little bit. And of course, today is the day when I don't get it on the first shot, but I just keep adjusting my knife until I find that joint. You don't have to break it, you just cut right through. So again, I prefer to take to separate these with the skin off. I find it a little bit easier, obviously, because I didn't get it on the first try, but that's okay. For my recipe, I am going to take the skin off, which is very easy to do. I often take just a paper towel to kind of grip onto that skin, and I just pull that right off. So I'm going to set those off to the side. So we're up to 6 pieces of chicken right now. When I cut my last 2 leg and thigh, that will make the 8 pieces that I need. So for my other leg, I am going to take the skin off all at once. And you really are just kind of finding an opening and you just pull it apart. And you just pull that off the end of the leg. This is where that paper towel comes in handy. Now we have our skinless leg. So we can kind of find a seam on the top to cut through, or we can flip this over and look for that fat line, that seam to cut through instead. Wow, I'm not on my chicken game today, but I started cutting through a hip bone. I can kind of look at it because it's opened up and see that my joint is just a little to the left. A good tip is if you are cutting, trying to separate your leg and thigh, and you hit bone, I recommend moving towards the drumstick instead. I think people often think that the drumsticks are bigger than they actually are. So I just move towards the drumstick and I can very easily cut through that joint. So I have my 2 breasts, my 2 drumsticks, my 2 thighs, my 2 wings, and that is our chicken. So I am going to use my thighs, my drumsticks, and actually my wings just for fun for our roast chicken dish later on. Now, something I forgot to mention at the beginning is I almost always cut my meat last for food safety reasons. I just like to do my fruits and vegetables and produce first, so I don't have to use multiple cutting boards. I'm doing the meat first today, just for the flow of things, but keep that in mind at home. For food safety, always just do your meat last. That way you have less dishes and less of a chance of your meat touching your produce. So I'm going to turn it over to Heather to talk about chicken purchasing. And when I come back, I'll show you all how to cut up some shrimp.
Thanks, Emily. So I know we had some questions in the chat about white meat versus dark meat. We're going to get into that a little later. Right now, I want to talk a little bit about some other things to look for when you are purchasing chicken. So you may have seen chicken in the grocery store with some labeling that references air chilled. And you probably haven't seen the term water chilled, but that is the other way of chilling chicken. So we have the traditional method for chilling chicken, and what this refers to is in the processing, the chicken after it's slaughtered has to be cooled down to 40 degrees within a certain amount of time for food safety. We can do this either by dunking the chicken in a chlorinated water bath or this other method of air chilling, which has been used extensively in Europe for a very long time. More recently, we are seeing it here in the US. And the things to keep in mind is that there are some pros to chilled chicken. Namely, we're going to get better flavor, better texture, faster cooking. And that's just because when we do the water chilling, we're going to have some water retention there. So just something to be mindful of. I've compared prices between these two options, and there, isn't a huge difference. So if it's something that you care about, I would definitely say look for that air chilled option. The other thing we might want to consider when thinking about purchasing chicken is looking at whether or not there's anything added to it. You may have noticed this in the past when you have been purchasing chicken. If you see something about added solution, or it might often be referred to as a broth being added to your chicken products. And that's really, the producers are going to tell you it's for enhanced flavor and juiciness, but we do need to be mindful, particularly with our folks that are on a sodium restriction, that this is adding sodium to the product before we even cook it. Raw chicken should only have about 50 to 75 milligrams of sodium for a 4-ounce serving. And some varieties you're going to see may have up to 400 milligrams when we have these solutions added. As far as boneless and bone-in goes, the biggest consideration here is cooking. So bone-in products for cooking are going to give a little bit more forgiveness. So it's harder to overcook a bone-in piece of chicken. Boneless also, we think of these as being, the cooking techniques you're going to use for boneless chicken are going to be things like quicker methods, sauteing, maybe even poaching. Bone-in is great for things like roasting. You're going to see Emily this is the recipe she's doing today. It's a great option for bone-in chicken is something like roasting or braising. And then we just wanted to remind everybody about the safe minimal internal temperature for poultry. And this goes for all poultry, whether it's whole pieces, cut pieces, ground, it doesn't matter. It's got to be 165 degrees Fahrenheit. And just as a reminder, you're going to take the temperature of a piece of chicken by inserting an instant read thermometer into the thickest part, trying not to get too close to a bone. If you have a bone, you don't want to touch the bone or get too close to a bone. And you need to read 165 for at least 15 seconds to know that it's cooked properly. And I think we're going back to Emily now, who's going to move into our shrimp.
Yes, thanks everyone, or thanks Heather for hearing about chicken. So I'm going to show you all how to devein some shrimp. I'm not sure which video is on right now, but you should be able to see my workstation. Thanks, Carrie. So Heather is also going to talk a little bit more about purchasing shrimp, but I have these shrimp right here. These are 10-15 count shrimp, and Heather will explain what that means. I bought these from the seafood counter at the grocery store earlier today, and on the label, it did say that they were previously frozen. So I like the 10-15 shrimp. They're nice and big. I did not buy easy peel shrimp. So these are just regular shell on shrimp, no head, obviously. So when we are looking at our shrimp, we are going to take the shell off. We also want to take the vein out of it. There's a couple of different ways to take the shell off. One method is taking kitchen shears and just cutting down what would be like the spine of the shrimp if shrimp had spines, and you just kind of cut down the side, peel everything away. I just do this by hand because there's not a lot of shrimp. I kind of open it up, see the little legs on the inside, and I actually start with the tail on the top, and you just use your thumbs to break apart kind of that seam where the legs were. So I kind of open that up. So now there's no shell all within the belly of the shrimp. And now I can easily take all of this and just peel off the shell in one fell swoop. We do have the tail. So if you want to leave the tail on for presentation purposes, you could do that. The tail is just this last little section of the shrimp. Personally, I hate being given shrimp with the tail on. I think it's just so much harder to eat. I don't like having to put my fork down to use my hands to then take the tail off the shrimp. So my little trick for taking the tail off is I will kind of pinch the top and the bottom, and I pinch it and kind of crack that tail. And I pinched a little too hard today, but you should be able to pinch it and have that tail come off so that you can preserve the tail meat. I got a little excited and pinched too hard, so that didn't come off, but that's okay. We're gonna save our shells to make shrimp stock with. So again, that's not going to waste. If you're doing this at home, I recommend peeling all of your shrimp at one time before moving on to deveining your shrimp. Just for today, I'm going to do one at a time just to kind of show you that process. So you can see I'm going to use my paring knife for this. You also might note that I have a paper towel right here, and that's going to come in handy to take the vein out of the shrimp. So to take the vein out, I'm just going to very gently, not using a lot of pressure, run the paring knife along the back of the shrimp. My paring knife is sharp. I barely used any pressure here. And this should open up the back of the shrimp. Now, the shrimp that I got today, they're pretty clean. I haven't had too many veins, but you can see this kind of dark line towards the bottom of my shrimp. That is the vein or the digestive tract of the shrimp, and I want to pull that out. So what I like to do is kind of use a pinching motion with my thumb and the side of my paring knife. I use the paring knife to pick that vein up and pinch and pull out. Now, the vein is stuck to my hand and my knife, the vein is very sticky. To get it off of my finger or my knife, I will just kind of rub that against a paper towel. The vein would rather stick to the paper towel than your knife or your hand, which is why it's handy to keep on hand. And then if there's any kind of vein sticking out at the bottom, you just pull that off. So I'm going to show you all one more shrimp, and this is going to be a good one, before I turn it over to Heather. So again, you can see I started to peel from the top where the head of the shrimp is, and I always do that, but I do really actually prefer starting near the tail to pull the legs apart. It's a new kind of method that I learned, and I do prefer it a lot better. I think it works a lot easier. So I've separated all of the legs, and again, in one kind of motion, I can pull all of those shells off. And I still have the tail on my shrimp, so I'm just going to kind of gently loosen that tail. I'm going to break it apart at the bottom, and that should kind of wiggle right out. So now I have the tail meat on this. And I said this is going to be a good shrimp because you can see this has a big vein. I can see it through the inside of the shrimp. So this is going to be kind of a gnarly one. So again, I'm going to take just my paring knife and very gently rub it along the edge of the back of the shrimp and kind of use my knife to reveal the inside. Now you can see we have this orange looking vein right here. That is normal. Some shrimp just kind of come like that. They're a little bit trickier to take out, but this is where I use, my thumb pinching kind of technique to try to pull that vein out. And I just keep revealing the inside, making sure that I get all of that vein all the way down the length of the shrimp. Now, when I get a shrimp that's like this, that has the orange vein, generally what I like to do before I cook it, because this vein is so messy and hard to take out, I do like to rinse off my shrimp before I cook them, just to make sure that they're nice and clean. Those veins can get kind of gritty sometimes. So I'm going to keep just peeling and deveining a few shrimp and let Heather talk to you all about purchasing methods.
Oh, gotta remember to unmute yourself. So I know Emily just sort of mentioned these things, and I saw a question come through about, why do we need to remove the vein? So she's kind of covering that here. It is definitely an aesthetics thing as well as for presentation. I always joke in my classes, I've eaten a lot of shrimp veins in my life and nothing bad has ever happened to me. But as she mentioned, it has a gritty texture. It doesn't look nice. It's nice to get rid of it. Shell on shrimp, I'm going to talk a little bit more about another reason besides the ones listed here, but they are cheaper, as well as you can save the shells for seafood stock. If we go to the next slide, I think we're going to talk about some more considerations. So when thinking about frozen shrimp versus fresh options, this may not be applicable to everyone based on where you live in the country. I know here, I'm in Louisiana, it's very easy to get fresh, never frozen shrimp, but not everywhere in the country is this a possibility. But we want to keep a couple of things in mind. So again, I'm going to talk about sodium. I feel like sodium is like my new favorite thing. I find this very interesting, partially because this actually happened to me. I wasn't being careful one time. I bought a bag of frozen shrimp. I came home, I cooked my food, and I said, why is this dish so salty? This is crazy. What is going on here? And when I actually dug the package out of the trash, I looked at it and realized, oh, there's added sodium in this shrimp that I didn't realize because I didn't look at the package before I bought it. So fresh Gulf shrimp, has about 97 milligrams of sodium for a 4-ounce portion. When we're looking at frozen varieties, if we're looking at just shell on frozen, it might be something more like 160 milligrams. And if we are talking about easy peel, we can get all the way up to 700 milligrams or more for that 4-ounce serving. That's because processing solutions are added. They also will add additional solutions to create the easy peel. If you've never seen those, they're the ones that have the vein already removed, but still have the shell on. So essentially you can just grab the little legs on the bottom and sort of pull the whole thing off, making them very easy to peel. But we got to keep in mind they do have extra sodium. The two things you want to look for on the nutrition label were the word sodium tripolyphosphate, and then the other one is sodium bisulfite. And sodium bisulfite is added to keep the shrimp pink and blemish free. Doesn't necessarily mean that they are fresher. It just means that they won't have those black spots that you do sometimes see on shrimp. And then the sodium tripolyphosphate is the one that's added to actually plump them up. This is the really sneaky one where they do this in scallops as well. They pump this product in, it helps the shrimp retain moisture, making them larger and weigh more. So you're actually paying more money for salt water, essentially, injected into your seafood. It's also going to really affect the cooking affect the cooking process. So shrimp that has this solution, it doesn't sear as well. It's going to end up not getting as much brown color on it, and it can create a more rubbery kind of tough texture in the finished product. So just if it's possible for you, try to get the fresh shrimp if you can. If not, try to find the frozen variety that has the least amount of sodium. Check that package. The last thing, the size. Emily wanted me to mention to you about the size. So she talked about her shrimp today being, I think she said 10 to 15. They're always going to be numbered, and the number means how many shrimp come in a pound. So if we look at something like a 26-30, that means 26 to 30 shrimp come in a pound. And then we have those really big boys like a U10 or U12. which means that you're going to get less than 10 or less than 12 per pound. Those are those really giant ones that you'll see sometimes in restaurants. I will say, I like a little bit of a smaller size shrimp if I'm doing something like a pasta. I think it kind of depends on how you're serving the shrimp. And lastly, our safe minimum internal temperatures for seafood. We wanted to mention this. So we don't actually have a safe minimum internal temperature for items like our shrimp, lobster, crab, and scallops. We do just want to look for more of what do they look like when they're done being cooked. So we're looking for that, that white, opaque, whereas for our fin fish, we do want to cook that to a minimum of 145. Now, Emily, as we turn it back over to you to continue on with this, I'm going to ask you a few questions that have come through in the chat. So let's see. We do have a question specifically about the orange vein. So can you speak to that? Can you confirm or deny if that is in fact the roe?
I honestly don't know.
I think the answer is yes. I'll look it up to be sure, but I'll write back in the chat. We answered this one. We do have a question, and I'm gonna take this over to you. It's back to our chicken for a second. For sous vide, which I know you've done sous vide more than I have. Is it safe to cook the chicken less or lower than 165 in a sous vide situation?
No, you would still want it to be 165. But the benefits of cooking something sous vide is that you're less likely to overcook that chicken. So generally when we sous vide, we use, like theoretically, if you wanted to, I wouldn't do this, but theoretically you could set your sous vide to 165 or 170 degrees. And, once your chicken has been in that hot water bath long enough to reach 165 degrees, it will never go above that temperature. I wouldn't sous vide that low because your chicken might take more than 4 hours to heat up all the way, and then that's a food safety concern. Generally, for things like chicken and meat, I think we sous vide between like 160 and 200 degrees. And then for steak and things that need a lower temperature, we might do a lower sous vide temperature. But no, I wouldn't do like 150 on a chicken breast because it's still never going to hit that 165 that we need.
That's what I was thinking too. I'm glad you confirmed. I was going to do some Googling, but I believe what you're telling me. All right, so I think we can go ahead and move on. I'll get to the rest of the questions. We'll get to all your questions. Do not worry.
Unless there's like way too many questions, then maybe not, but we will try. All right, so next we are going to make our roast chicken legs with potatoes, cauliflower, and olives. And again, I cut up my chicken legs already. I believe the recipe calls for chicken leg quarters. I like to separate the legs sometimes just for quicker cooking, but you can also leave those legs together. And if you're at home, I do recommend, doing your vegetables first before the chicken. So for our recipe, our potatoes call to be cut in 1-inch wedges. But potatoes are perfect for learning how to dice. So I'm going to show you a few different ways to cut up our potatoes. And before we get started, we want to make sure that we're holding our knife properly. So again, I'm using my trusty Santoku knife. Y'all saw me hone this already. I know it's nice and sharp. If I kind of drag my thumb across the surface of it, it feels rough. It feels gritty. I can basically feel it kind of dragging against my fingerprint. If you drag your knife again, or if you drag your thumb against your knife and it feels dull or like rounded and smooth, that's a sign that your knife is not very sharp. You want to hone that or bring that in to be sharpened. When we're holding our knife, I am going to take my thumb and my index finger, and I'm actually going to pinch the blade of the knife. The rest of my fingers will wrap around the handle. And when I'm holding on to my knife, I'm kind of like using the bolster as like a kind of like set point. So I'm kind of like holding against the bolster of the knife. So, but you should be touching metal here. And then just have a good grip this way. So I don't want to hold my knife all the way down here. I'm not going to have as good of a grip this way. I don't have as much control. We want control to be safe. If you tend to pop your finger up like this, I implore you to stop doing that. It feels like you have more control. It feels like, you know, okay, I can push down really hard on something. All you're going to do is make your finger tired. So if you already do this, try just putting your finger down on the side instead. Our other hand is going to be in this claw shape, kind of like this, thumb and pinkies included. Everything stays nice and tight. And that is because if I lift up my knife, even pretty high, nothing's going under my blade. Nothing's going to get cut off. My fingers are sticking out. Those can fit under my blade. I'm not going to show you because I'm scared, but my fingers could fit under my blade if they were sticking out. So you always want to curl those underneath. When I use finer techniques, if I'm making small dice, things that are more precise, I actually will use my knuckle too to guide my knife on where it goes. And when I'm chopping, I'm almost always have my knife in contact with my other hand. This is just a great way to be aware of your surroundings and stay safe. And if you need some reminder for that, the advice that a chef at a restaurant I used to work at told me was, I want to see your knuckles silver from rubbing up against your knife so much, which is impossible. That won't happen. But you know, keep that in mind. You always want your knife rubbing against your knuckle. Now, we are going to dice our potato. So just for fun, I'm going to show you like different sizes of dices that we can do on one of the potatoes. So first things first, when we have something round like a potato, we generally cut things that are round like this the same way. A good starting point is to make a flat surface so this doesn't roll away on me. And so I'm going to hold this up using my claw, and I'm going to cut one edge off. Now my potato has a flat surface. It's not going to roll around anymore. So I'm going to make what would be considered like a small or a medium dice, just to show you the technique. I'm going to start by cutting my potato into some planks, and I want the planks to be as thick as I want my dice to be. So I'm going to go for maybe a 1/2 inch, 2 centimeters. I'm honestly very bad at estimating sizes, but I want these all to be about the same thickness, and I'm just making these nice thick planks here. And I also kind of keep that in mind when I cut off my first piece for my flat surface. But you can see, especially with these middle slices, we have a nice even thickness on both pieces. From here, I have my planks. Now what I'm going to do is cut this into sticks. So I want to maintain that same thickness throughout when I make my sticks of my potato. So we can see that the thickness of my stick kind of matches the thickness of that plank. It should be a nice square. And then from here, we can keep all of these together, turn those, and then finish making our dice. And that is like a small to a medium-sized dice. You should have a nice cube shape here. It doesn't need to be perfect because this is not a 5-star restaurant, but it looks nice. It's going to cook evenly. This is kind of our goal when we're making a dice. You'll note I did not cut my potatoes into rounds first. I don't like doing that because it just is a slower process. So anything long and round like a potato, you want to make, you know, these planks first, then you make your sticks, then you have your dice. So I'm going to finish cutting up this first potato. Heather, do we have any questions I can answer while I'm cutting this potato? Heather, you're muted.
I know, I'm sorry. We've been talking in the chat a bit about stock. So this kind of goes a little off topic, but do you want to talk about how to store stock, how long you can store it? We talked about how to store the scraps before making the stock, but Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, I can talk really quick about that. So if you're going to use the stock within the week for like soup or something, you can store it in the fridge. You do want to make sure that you cool down that stock as fast as you can. You really want to avoid putting a hot liquid in a container, then putting the lid on and putting it in your fridge, because it's one, going to heat up your fridge, and two, it's going to not cool down fast enough. We want that stock to cool down to room temperature within 4 hours. So I recommend, kind of putting your stock, dividing it up between different containers, let it sit on your counter for an hour, check back in on it. Once it's a nice room temperature, stick it in your fridge. Once it's cold, you could keep it in your freezer. I have some. My apartment's so small, it's so easy for me to find things. You can keep it in your freezer. You want to label it and date it, which I didn't do here. So, do as I say, not as I do. But keep it in your freezer, and then you have chicken stock on hand. This will last at least 3 months. I would say 3 to 6 months in your freezer. Then you just have, stock on hand ready for soup or stews. So for our next potato, I'm going to actually cut this into wedges like the recipe called for. So to cut into wedges, we're going to start by cutting in half and then in half again. And this is what I would consider a really thick wedge. We want these to cook pretty evenly and at the same rate as our other vegetables, and I believe the recipe calls for 1-inch wedges. So what I like to do is then cut this wedge in half again. There's 2 ways we can do this. One, by kind of making this bridge with our finger to hold this in place and just cutting through the top of that point. I always recommend doing this bridge and having a good hold on everything. I kind of will see people a lot, they'll like not use their other hand and just like try to cut something, but it's wobbly, you're gonna slip, or they don't really control their knife as much when their fingers are vulnerable like this. And when you don't have good control over your knife and you just kind of are like loosey-goosey with it, that's another time when you might slip. So good control with my fingers, a nice good pinch, good control with my knife. I hold on to it very carefully the entire time to cut that wedge in half again. And then just to make them shorter, I just cut them in half like that. I think that's a nice little piece of potato. We're gonna get some crispy edges on that. If you don't want to do it that way, you can also just lay your potato on the side, and we're gonna come at it at an angle. I don't know if you can see that. I'm at an angle and I'm cutting towards the point of my wedge. So I will still have 2 wedges that come to a point. I like cutting potatoes in wedges because it is much faster than dicing them. But that dice technique that I showed y'all earlier, you can use that on so many different vegetables. So I use that on potatoes, I use that on carrots, squash, anything long and round. That is the technique that we use that for. Now our potatoes are done. I just have those in a bowl off to the side. I'm going to do my cauliflower next. So this is how cauliflower comes most of the time. I've never seen a cauliflower not come with the stem on. This has a pretty hardy stem. I don't bother trying to rip this off or anything like that. I'm going to show you like my kind of tip for quickly taking the stem off of the cauliflower. So because the stem is so long on this, I can't really stand it up straight. It's really wobbly. So I am actually going to lay it on its side just so I have a more, solid surface. Then I'm going to cut this in half. And again, I'm using kind of my bridge technique just to have a good hold on this, but I'm keeping good control of my knife. I'm very carefully cutting that in half. From here, I'm going to cut this in half again. You could cut through the middle this way, keeping it exposed, but a safer method is to flip these over so they're on a flat surface. Just cut in half, making sure to get that stem on both sides. Now, if we look at our cauliflower, we have a quarter cauliflower and we can see this stem right here. So basically, I'm just going to make a cut in my cauliflower, cutting the florets off to one side and my stem off to another side. So I lay this on its side and I bring my knife in at an angle. It's not up straight, it's at an angle. And you can see I want to have the florets on top, the stem on the bottom. I just make one chop and all of my stem is on off to the side, and I have my florets right here. And this is why it's nice to have a scrap bowl handy, so I can easily get rid of all those scraps and not have a huge mess on my cutting board. One more. All right, so cauliflower are pretty easy to cut. I find them easier than broccoli to deal with, actually. And I work with a lot of people that have never cut cauliflower before, so I love showing how to do this because it's kind of intimidating, but once you know how to do it, so much easier. So you can see on this first piece that I cut, I see a lot of stems open up. So I can just start, kind of pulling these apart as they are available. This, I can see that all of the stem is still connected, but there are some joints that are pretty thin, so I can still start to kind of pull this apart until I have pieces that are just one thick stalk. So I want my cauliflower to be about the same size as my potato, so they cook evenly. I'm also thinking about how am I going to eat this? This huge piece of cauliflower is not going to fit in my mouth. I don't want to eat it like that. I would need to take a knife and fork to this. So instead, I want a nice small piece of cauliflower that's going to be much easier to eat. So I always start by kind of taking my small pieces of cauliflower that are already broken apart and putting those into my bowl off to the side. And then with these bigger pieces, I'm just going to chop them until they're the size that I want them to be. So this will be my reference point right here. This is something good to, a little trick that's nice. Keep something as a reference, just like at the upper corner of your cutting board, so you can kind of keep in mind what your goal is. So you can just kind of slice through the stem of that cauliflower to make thinner pieces. This guy is still a little big, but I can actually just pull that stem apart and have my nice small pieces. For these like big guys like this that are huge and really round, I generally will just cut them into quarters. I will sometimes even cut through the stem sideways, not like through the length of the stem. This isn't like broccoli where it all falls apart. This cauliflower like kind of holds its shape really well. So I kind of just want to make the shape the size I want it to be. And I'm not so focused on always cutting through the middle of the stem. So you'll see like this piece right here, I might cut in half, but I might, the stem's going this way. I still might kind of cut it in half through that stem just to get a nice size of cauliflower. And while I finish chopping this up, Heather, do you have any questions that I could answer?
I do not, but I am going to give you a quick time check. We are a little behind at the moment, but it's okay.
That's fine. I will be finished up with this recipe very shortly. So all of the rest of this kind of stuff right here, I just use my bench scraper to put that into my bowl. So in my bowl, I have my cauliflower and potatoes all cut up. Now for this recipe, and my olives. These are great. They add umami, a little salt. I'm just going to throw these straight into my bowl. Sometimes I cut them in half, but they're so small, I'm not going to cut them. To make my seasoning, I'm going to add some salt, about a 1/4 teaspoon of salt to 2 tablespoons of oil. And then I'm going to add some salt-free adobo seasoning. The adobo, especially like the Goya adobo, is super popular where I live. So I love showing how to make a nice salt-free version of that. And I'm going to mix this together to make basically like a seasoning paste. This is a new technique that I've started doing that I find is way easier to like kind of get our seasonings onto our vegetables in a more even way. So I'm gonna add, honestly, most of it, I would say about 3/4 of that to my vegetables. And I'm going to toss this all together. I'm just gonna kind of toss everything in a bowl like this. You could also use your hands or a spoon to mix everything together, but I have a very small bowl. So I'm just gonna do my best like this. And then I'm going to spread everything out onto my sheet pan. This is a very well seasoned sheet pan. I'm not going to use parchment paper or anything. I did lightly oil this just to keep my vegetables from sticking too much. And then I have my chicken that I'm going to add to the same bowl with the rest of that seasoning mixture. Scoop that all out because that's some good stuff in there. And you just kind of mix the chicken with the rest of their seasoning mixture in the same bowl, so we're making less dishes. And this is just a 1 pan or in a sheet pan meal. So I'm going to kind of spread the vegetables out towards the edges of the pan and just arrange my chicken in the middle. And this is all going to just cook together in a high heat oven. I think my oven's set to like 425, 450 degrees. And we will check back in on this in a few minutes. So I'm going to turn it over to Heather.
Awesome. That looks so delicious, Emily. Real quick though, if somebody does not have the adobo seasoning that your blend that you provided, do you have any other recommendations? I was gonna say whatever you like, right? Like any seasoning blend you have on hand that you like.
Yes, I was muted, sorry. Yes, any seasoning you like. I specifically have this recipe because it, appeals to the community that I work with. But yeah, any seasoning blend is going to work there.
Awesome. Okay, so let's take a look at the nutrition as well as some pricing considerations when we're talking about chicken. So this question came up quite a bit in terms of light meat, white meat chicken versus dark meat chicken. Some people were commenting that they've heard that dark meat chicken may be, in fact, as bad for us or as unhealthy as our red meats, our beef and pork. This is what the analysis shows. So these nutrition facts came right from the USDA database. They are based on 4-ounce portions of chicken, which is what we recommend as a proper serving size of chicken. So if we look, I think the most interesting thing to me is the calories on a boneless, skinless breast versus a boneless, skinless thigh. Same. But if we look at the fat and the saturated fat, obviously that's where we see a little bit of an increase between those two products. And just to break it down for you, the difference between these two things are that our dark meat actually has more myoglobin. That's that protein that gives it the darker reddish color when it's raw. And as you know, even when it's cooked, it's still a little darker in color. But it is higher. It does tend to be a little higher in iron and zinc than our white meat chicken. And because it has that higher proportion of fat, it is a little lower in protein. So you see that there in the chart. The protein in our chicken breast is 26 grams, whereas our thigh only has 22. Now, these are really minor differences. But where you do see the bigger difference in terms of fat and saturated fat are going to be when we're talking about our skin on. So even though I've listed these as bone in, skin on breast and thigh, The bone is not the thing that's causing any of the additional calories or fat there. It's the skin. So in Emily's recipe, you saw what she did. She left those bones in, but she actually removed the skin before cooking, which is a great thing to do. So she's got the, added insulation of the bone, but she took away the skin. So she's removing that fat before cooking. Now, you can also remove the fat after cooking. Some of it will still be there, of course, but generally speaking, if you don't eat the skin, you're not going to get the bulk of that fat. I did want to include some price considerations here. Now, these prices I pulled from Walmart. I attempted to go in person and get prices on all of these products, but I actually had a hard time finding every product at the same store. So I went to Walmart's website and pulled prices there. So you'll see, we know boneless, skinless chicken breast is going to be our most expensive option. And buying the pieces that have the bone in and the skin on are cheaper. And like Emily did, we could buy those and actually just go ahead and remove the skin, save ourselves some calories right off the bat. I did also want to mention that the whole chicken price is very cheap. $1.99. I actually got that price at Whole Foods because it's next door to where I work. $1.99 for a whole chicken, $2.99 a pound for the air chilled fancy whole chicken. Still not super expensive. And as Emily demonstrated earlier, we see that it's not that hard to break it down into pieces. Emily, are we ready? Are you ready for us to move on?
I am ready.
Cool.
All right. You should be able to see my cutting board. Perfect. Thanks, Carrie. Carrie's like the silent kind of person that makes everything happen correctly. So next we are going to get into some pico de gallo and some pickled red onions. If you've taken classes with us before, we have shown you how to cut onions, but it's always a nice refresher. So I'm going to start by making my pickling liquid for my red onions. I am going to add a half cup of water to a small pot. I'm also going to add a half cup of vinegar. This is just vinegar with the mother in it. That's why it looks kind of chunky. It was the bottom of the bottle. And then to this, I'm also going to add a tablespoon and a half of sugar and a teaspoon and a half of salt. And I'm just going to set this on the stove. I just want this to come to a boil, and I want to make sure that my salt and sugar are dissolved. So for pickled red onions, I am going to start with a red onion, obviously. Now this onion has had some of the skin peeled off already, so just kind of keep that in mind. So when we look at our onion, the anatomy of an onion, we have the top, this kind of papery bit, and then the bottom, the roots that are the more stringy bits. So generally in class, we say never to cut the root off the onion. However, for my pickled red onions, I will be cutting this into a julienne. We remember from earlier, the julienne is long, thin strips. For this cut, I am going to start by cutting off both ends of my onion. And you can save these onion ends for the chicken stock that you're going to make later with all those chicken bones that we have. So I've cut the ends of my onion off. I'm just going to go ahead and cut this in half now. Once you cut your onion in half, it is much easier to peel. So that is just something to keep in mind. I see people all the time trying to peel a whole onion, and that is just way harder than it needs to be. So let's all make our lives easier and cut them in half before we peel. All right, so we are going to julienne these onions. There are two ways to do this. So if we look at our onion cross section, we kind of see this like rainbow arch shape. So one way that I see people thinly slice their onions is they will cut them with the intention of having this kind of arch shape in the end. This can work. They do look kind of nice, but something to keep in mind is we now have some really big pieces and some really small pieces. So if we were to cook these, like if we wanted to make caramelized onions, our small pieces are going to burn before our big pieces are cooked. And for the pickled red onions, the little small pieces are honestly just very hard to fish out of your jar. So this can work. Sometimes it looks nice, maybe on a salad, it kind of looks nice. But instead of cutting with the intention of getting that rainbow shape, we're instead just going to turn our onion and we are going to cut along the curve of the onion. And if we look closely at onions, we do see these kind of lines here. So we're going to cut with those lines. When I start, because my onion is curved, I'm not going to cut straight down. I want to follow the curve of the onion. So I'm actually going to start with my knife at an angle because I want to cut in towards the center of the onion. This is a great time to practice, using your knuckle to rub up against your knife. I'm going to use my knuckle to determine how thin or how thick I want to make my sliced onions. So I'm going to start on one end. My knife is at an angle. And when I'm cutting, notice that I'm not cutting straight down. I'm actually using kind of a forward sawing motion or a rocking motion as I'm cutting through that onion. So again, I'm kind of pushing down and forward at the same time. This allows you to use less pressure while you're cutting. And if your knife is a little bit dull, it makes your life a lot easier too. So we can see with these slices, instead of the rainbow shape, we have things or slices that are going to be a bit more evenly sized and shaped. So in my red onions or my pickled onions, this is nice because they all look the same on the jar. If I have this as a topping for something, it's going to be a nice uniform shape. And if I'm cooking them, then they're going to cook evenly. So I'm going to keep slicing this onion. And as I get to the end, it is going to kind of fall over onto its side when it's a little bit wobbly. And we just start back over again until everything is sliced. So again, when I'm slicing my red onion, I'm going to start kind of on the side and follow the curve of the knife. I eventually do straighten out my knife, so it's no longer sideways, it's now straight up as I reach the middle of that onion, always using my rocking technique. And now that this is kind of at the edge, a little wobbly, I just tip that over to finish slicing those onions. And you'll notice even at the very, very edge, I still have my claw. Sometimes it kind of looks like this when you got to pinch onto something to hold it really tightly. And my pickling liquid is boiling. So for pickled red onions, I like to keep these wide mouth mason jars on hand. And I'm going to pack this onion into my jar. And it's okay to like tightly pack this in there. The onions will soften as they kind of cook a little bit in that pickling liquid. Let me just use my bench scraper because that is easier. So I have my jar full of onions. My liquid is boiling. You can see right here, just came off the stove. You want your liquid to be hot because you want this to like partially cook your onions. I can see that there's still some stuff that's not fully dissolved in the bottom, so I'm just going to give that a stir to make sure that that sugar is dissolved. And you want to just pour that hot liquid into your jar. And if you have a little extra liquid, just leave that off to the side, maybe use that for something else. We don't want to overfill this. And then I do like to just press everything down really quickly to make sure everything is nice and submerged. Now, if you want to use these right away, you can set these on your counter for about half an hour to pickle and cool down. Otherwise, still let it cool down, but you can also throw those in the fridge. So we'll check in on those later and see how they're looking. Now we are going to make our pico de gallo. So for our pico de gallo, we have tomato, onion, a jalapeno, and some lime juice and salt. So I'm going to start with my onion for my pico. This is a white onion. White onions are great if you're going to have some kind of raw onion because they have a milder flavor than the yellow onions. They are a bit trickier to tell the root and the stem apart from because almost always on a white onion, the root has been trimmed off. So you just need to find the hard part of the onion and try to identify the softer papery end. This is the stem, the hard part is the root. I'm going to dice this. So for my dice, I want to keep the root on, but I can go ahead and cut that top off. And this is nice because now I have a flat surface. My onion is not rolling all over the place anymore. So I'm going to cut straight through the middle of that root to reveal the inside of my onion. You should have root on both ends. From here, again, always easier to peel your onion after it has been cut in half. And we're going to dice this. So when I dice, I generally have the root facing away from me. Just like our julienne, we're going to make slices into our onion, starting on one side and kind of working like over that curve of the onion, following those natural lines that it has. But I don't want to cut through the tip of the onion. So my kind of guideline is like 1 finger's width. That's where I stop cutting. The trick is making sure that the tip of your blade is not going over where you want to cut. I see people making this mistake all the time. They have their knife like this and they cut down and then they wonder why their onion is no longer together. So pull the tip of your knife back. Now for this, I want to do a small dice, which means that my slices are going to be close together. So I'm going to start on one end and I kind of lead with the tip of my knife with this and I let the rest of my blade follow. So kind of put the tip in all the way to the cutting board and let the rest of that knife follow. So we're making slices into our onion, but it is not falling apart because we're leaving the root intact. And I just keep going. And you can see for this last bit, I do kind of hold the onion in place, but I move my thumb out of the way because I don't want to slice that. So now our onion has been cut. We have these nice thin slices. They're not falling apart, so we don't have a mess all over our cutting board. I'm going to turn this. So now the root was at the top. Now the root is facing the left because I'm right-handed. So I'm going to hold this with my left hand. And we're going to cut against those slices we made. Just like the potato, we want, a nice even cube. So you kind of have to eyeball it, line it up. Make sure that when you cut down, it's the same width as your slices. And again, I use this slicing motion, this rocking down and forward motion to cut into my onion to make this dice. And another nice thing about leaving the root on, it is kind of like a nice thing that we can hold on to. Once I get to the end, I do like to knock this over and just cut off that kind of last remaining pieces of the onion. So I'm just left with a little bit of root. I don't want too much food waste here, but we can use that in stock. Now for my dice, everything is a nice even size, even shape, and it's going to be very nice in my pico de gallo. So because I want kind of a size reference, I'm going to just keep some of this, at the top of my cutting board. So when I cut my tomato, I know what size I want it to be because I want my tomato to match my onion. And I'm just going to throw that into a bowl that I can mix everything together in. All right, for our tomato, got a big boy tomato today. I do like to try to take the stem out of the tomato if I can, just this green part. It doesn't want to come out. Oh, I got it. Okay. Just because it's in my way and I don't want to deal with it. So I've ripped that stem out. And now to dice the tomato, I see a lot of people, they kind of cut their tomato into quarters. And then you have this like non-square shape that you're trying to make into a square. And it just like doesn't work. So instead, what I like to do is flip my tomato over because this is kind of flat on the top. And just like my potato, I'm going to cut this into planks. So starting at one end, using a sawing motion, I'm going to cut this into thin planks. Now, if your knife is sharp, this should be easy. I'm using a forward and back sawing motion as I go. If your knife is dull, it's going to be harder to cut through the tomato. This is really where you want to use that sawing motion. Then when I have all of my slices together, you'll note that I did not take the stem out, and that is because I have my little trick for cutting my stem out afterwards. So I have these three kind of pieces with a little stem in them. I just cut a small triangle into my tomato and just kind of pull that stem out. To me, this is easier than trying to take it out while the tomato is whole, and I also end up with less food waste. So now with my tomato, just like my potato, I have my plank. I want to cut this into some thin strips. And even when I'm cutting through the side, you'll notice forward and back, forward and back. I'm never cutting straight down, especially with a tomato. You cut straight down, you're going to have tomato going all over the place. So now I have my sticks. They're all lined up. I like to keep them together, and I'm going to cut that into a dice. So we have my nice dice. My onion is white, so it's very hard to see against my cutting board, but my onion and my tomato are about the same size. You can also, if you want to, stack some pieces on top of each other to save some time. Like that. So I have two pieces. I'm going twice as fast. Hold on to everything as you turn it. And again, use that forward and back motion to finish your dice, especially when you're doing two pieces at a time. You really want to use that sawing or that rocking motion. If you cut straight down, that again is where you just get tomato going all over the place. So if I just cut straight down, it's harder to do. You see, like, the tomato kind of just wants to go all over the place. My knife is very sharp, so that was easier for me to do. But if your knife's dull, it just won't work. I'm just gonna finish cutting this tomato. It was a big boy, so I'm just gonna go through this a little bit quickly. And I do have my other tomatoes already cut up. One thing to note about this pico de gallo recipe, I believe I'm making this out of order. I think it recommends to cut the onion first and kind of have that marinating in the lime juice while you cut everything else. And that does help to get rid of any like harsh raw onion flavor. Another tip, if you're really averse to raw onion, is to let it soak in cold water for a few minutes before adding it to, your salad, your salsa beforehand, and just sitting in that like kind of cold water will get rid of that harsh flavor. All right, so we have our onion in here, and we can see that our tomato is about the same size as the onion, which is great. And we went for like a small-ish dice. We could go smaller if we want to, but I'd like a really chunky pico de gallo. Next thing we're going to do, here's my little trick. If your cutting board is really juicy, take your bowl, put it off the side of your cutting board, and use your bench scraper to get rid of all that juice. I hate a dirty cutting board, so these bench scrapers are awesome. Next thing we're going to do is our jalapeno. So this is a spicy pepper. It's not super spicy, but spicy enough that if it gets on your hands, it doesn't feel good in about an hour. You get what I lovingly refer to as spicy hands. Maybe other people call it that too, but I call it spicy hands. So I do like to put on some gloves when I'm working with any kind of hot pepper. Now, if you don't have gloves at home and you're working with a hot pepper, I recommend washing your hands immediately after you're done cutting it, ideally with dish soap. Like Dawn dish soap works really well to get the spicy off of your hands. So I have my gloves on. To cut my jalapeno, I want to make this small, kind of like a mince, but it's really just going to be like a small dice. I'm going to cut the stem off of my pepper, and then I'm going to go ahead and cut that in half. In order to take the seeds out, I like to grab a spoon. I don't like using a knife for this. I like to have a good hold on the pepper, and starting at the top, I get my spoon underneath the membrane and the seeds and just scoop that out. And you can also use your spoon to kind of scoop out any remaining seeds that are left over. So again, spoon kind of goes in the edge of the pepper here, and then I use that to scrape out any remaining seeds. If you're a fan of spicy food, you can also leave the seeds in if you want to. So for my pepper, I recommend cutting through the inside of the pepper. The outside is kind of waxy and hard to cut through, so we'll want to go through the inside. And I like to just use the tip of my blade to kind of make these thin slices instead of just chopping through it. I find that just pulling my blade along the cutting board allows me to have a better hold on the pepper and still get some nice even slices. From here, I'm going to hold all of these sticks together, and using this forward and back rocking motion, I'm going to cut these slices very small. So this is not quite a brunoise, which is a very, very small dice, but it's a pretty small dice. I do like my jalapeno to be smaller than the tomatoes and the onions. And you can see I saved my pepper for last. That way, once I'm done with this, I can get rid of the knife, get rid of the cutting board, and not have anything get spicy. And I actually realized I didn't save this for last. I still have cilantro, but it's fine. I'm just going to keep my gloves on while I'm working with, this now spicy cutting board. Next thing I'm going to do is juice my limes. So we're going to start by cutting these in half. I like to cut through the equator of the lime, but you can cut through the other way as well. There's a few ways to juice a lime. We could use this handy dandy juicer, put the lime in, cut side down, and squeeze. These juices are great. If you ever want to buy one, I recommend getting the orange one because it fits all of your citrus, not just limes. So we can use a citrus juicer. We could also use one of these. This is called a reamer. And you basically stick that in your lime and twist, and that kind of gets all of the juice out. You do have to squeeze on your lime as you're doing this, but the reamers do work really well to get all of the juice out of your lime. You can see that's nice and empty now. Or you can do my personal favorite, because it's quick, easy, doesn't make a lot of dishes, is I just use a fork. So you stick your fork into the middle of the lime, and then as you squeeze, you jimmy that fork up and down to get that juice out. And you can see I'm turning my lime as I do this, but it gives you a similar result that the reamer does. Just gonna get the rest of that lime. So now we have the juice of 2 limes in our salsa. The last thing we need is cilantro. I kind of hate cutting fresh herbs, mostly because they get all over the place. I also hate picking herbs. Something like cilantro or parsley, they have tender stems, so we can use the stems in our recipes. So I have my bunch here. It's about a half of a bunch of cilantro, and we're going to do a version of a chiffonade. So what I like to do is have all of my stems on one end, all of my leaves on the other end. I'll take the ends of the leaves, fold them over on themselves, and then from here, I'm going to roll this up into a tight bundle. So now I have this nice tight bundle of all of my herbs, and I'm going to use this rocking motion, my slicing motion, to cut this as thin as I can. And as I'm cutting down, I'm kind of making a chiffonade, but because of the shape of the cilantro, because it's so small, it just, dices it nicely for me, or chops it up nicely for me. And I don't mind getting stem in there because those cilantro stems have great flavor to them, and they're nice and tender. So I just keep chopping down until I have mostly stems left. You can save the stems to make like a black bean soup or something with if you want. So now I kind of have like a chiffonaded, long ribbony cilantro. I like cilantro, I usually leave it big, but if you wanted to make this small, you can do kind of like a mince on this, where the tip of our blade is on our cutting board. And we're just gonna chop up and down, kind of back and forth on this to make that cilantro a little bit smaller. Clean that off. We're gonna use our bench scraper to add this to our salsa. I can take my gloves off now because I'm done using that cutting board. And let's mix this all together. So I'm just gonna give this a quick mix. And this is our pico de gallo. Beautiful, bright, nice and colorful, really tasty sauce that we've made. All right, so I'm gonna turn this over to Heather.
Thanks, Emily. We've got some great conversations going in the chat about people growing their own veggies and herbs, which is really fun. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about pico de gallo for a second while Emily gets cleaned up before she moves on to the next recipe, and tell you why we love it so much. So pico de gallo, it's a great fresh salsa. We like to remind people too that fresh salsa like this is a really nutritious option for snacks. We have our great homemade baked corn tortilla chips, which are awesome for serving with this as a snack. But you can do a lot of other things with it as well. Some great tips about things that you can add to a recipe like this. We love adding fruit. We have a version of this recipe that we do really often that has mango, but other fruit like pineapple or even strawberry can work really well. And then you can also think about adding things like bell pepper or even diced cucumber or corn, as well as adding some protein with maybe some black beans or some chickpeas. And then I like to point out that it's great if you want to make it in advance and use it throughout the week. It will keep pretty well for a couple of days. I love adding it to things like even just using it in my salads or as a component in like a grain bowl. Great on grilled fish, chicken, or even if you want to just like mix it into your steamed rice or quinoa, something like that. Oh my gosh, so many questions are coming through and comments are coming through in the chat. I know I did see a comment here about in the Q&A about cilantro sub. Do you have any particular thoughts, Emily, on what you would sub for cilantro for our folks that have that soap gene?
That hate cilantro.
Soap?
Yeah, I mean, I have a friend that hates cilantro. Generally I just leave it out of something I'm making. You could, if you want that green, you could use parsley. It does have a different flavor to the cilantro, but you could try some parsley in there if you want. I would go for the flat parsley instead of the curly parsley.
Yeah, I've definitely used parsley in a pico de gallo, and it's fun. It's great. I mean, I think, someone here is saying mint basil. Yeah, I mean, if you like mint basil,
any herb,
go for it.
All right, let's get started with our spring rolls, just because I want to make sure y'all have enough time to see these, and that we have time for Q&A. So I have my spring roll set up. I'm going to start by making my dipping sauce first, just because it's nicer the longer that it sits. So we're making a fish sauce based dipping sauce called Nook Jum. So in there, we are going to add 2 tablespoons of fish sauce. You could also use a little soy sauce if you do not eat fish. We're going to add 3 tablespoons of water, ideally warm water, because we're also adding 2 tablespoons of sugar. Nook Jum is a nice kind of balance of sweet and tangy and spicy and salty. So that sugar is very important there. Using warm water will allow that sugar to just dissolve a little bit faster. We're also going to add, I believe, 1 tablespoon of lime juice. I just used a whole lime, I didn't measure it. We're also going to use a teaspoon of rice vinegar, unseasoned. rice vinegar, no added sugar in there. I like to make it spicy, so we're going to add some chili garlic paste or chili sambal, which you can find at most grocery stores these days. And to this, we're going to add a minced clove of garlic and a minced Thai pepper. And my camera doesn't want to focus, but that's okay. So for our garlic, we just need 1 clove. We're going to mince it. To start with my garlic, if the kind of tip of the garlic is really hard, I do like to cut that off. And then to peel the garlic, I'm going to lay my knife flat on the cutting board, and I'm going to use the heel of my hand and my body weight to really smash that piece of garlic flat. When I do this, the rest of that paper should come off very easily. Now, when we're mincing, I kind of showed you the technique earlier with the cilantro, but basically you're going to put the tip of your blade on the cutting board, your non-dominant hand flat on top of the cutting board, and you're just going to chop up and down while kind of rotating back and forth. And one thing I like to do too, if you're ever on like a wobbly table, like I am, I do actually kind of rest my hand on the cutting board while I'm chopping, just so I have another like anchor point. And garlic's really easy to cut through, so we don't have to use like a slicing motion. I'm just going up and down, back and forth as fast as I can to mince that. If you're cutting multiple cloves of garlic at a time, peel all of your garlic first, then you can mince them all at the same time. So now my garlic is nice and small, nice and minced. This is going to get added to my nukjum. That's why we like to make this first, so that garlic flavor can really, get in my sauce. Then we're going to add a Thai pepper, which is why I have my gloves on. So this is a nice spicy pepper. If you don't have a Thai pepper, you could also use a serrano pepper or even a jalapeno if that's all you have access to. So just like my jalapeno, I'm going to slice the stem off of that. And then to take the seeds out, I kind of roll this in my fingers. It's hard to show, but I'm basically rolling this in my fingers, and that is encouraging the seeds to make their way to the outside of the pepper. That way I don't have to slice into it, because it's such a small pepper. It's really hard to, slice like we did with the jalapeno. Now with this, what we can do is make a couple slices into this, and just like with our garlic, we are going to mince that up. Now, if you are spice averse, you can always leave the chili garlic sauce out of our nukjum. You could do, just a little bit of jalapeno, not a ton, or you could leave the hot pepper out and maybe just do a tiny dash of like the chili pepper sauce or the sriracha, and you can, leave the other peppers out. So we can see this is cut nice and small. That is going to go in my nukjum. I'm gonna let this, just chill and hang out until my spring rolls are ready. And I'm gonna do a little trick. It's not really a trick. I'm just gonna flip over my cutting board because it's spicy on there. I don't really want to accidentally touch that with my hands. And because my knife is spicy, I'm gonna switch over to my Japanese blade. So for our spring rolls, this is all about mise en place. So we got all kinds of vegetables all laid out already and ready to go. So we have some mint and basil. I like to leave these whole for my spring rolls, so I'm not really going to cut these. I already showed you how to chiffonade earlier. I also have some more cilantro. So the first thing I'm going to show y'all how to do are our carrots. So we want to julienne these. There are a few different ways to do this. We can, if we want to, basically cut these at a really sharp bias. So instead of my knife, being straight perpendicular to my carrot, I can turn it at a sharp angle and make these kind of long bias cut pieces of carrot that look like this. And then from there, I can, as thin as possible, make nice sticks out of this. So that's kind of like a quick and dirty way to do that. Another option could be, I'm going to put this into my mise en place bowl so it's ready to go. Another option could be to, with our carrot, I like to trim this to make it smaller and easier to manage. Just like with our other items, cut this into planks, but we're going to cut this into really thin planks. You can see I'm standing it up on the flat edge to do that. And then from these thin planks, just like before, cut this into really thin julienne, or sometimes we call it matchsticks. Because this is raw, I want to make this pretty small. That way it's easier for me to eat in my spring roll. So that's our carrot. Next, we're going to do our bell pepper. There's a few different ways to cut a bell pepper. I'm going to show you the way that maybe doesn't give you the most uniform shape, but you get the least amount of food waste with it. So we're going to view our pepper as having 4 walls, and we're going to cut those walls down. So right to the side of my stem, I make my first slice, I reveal the seeds, and then I just continue to cut down around those seeds. And then I cut the bottom off as well. So by doing this, my seeds are nice and contained. I don't have a lot of food waste. And now with my peppers, what I can do is just like with my jalapeno, I'm going to use the tip of my blade to make some nice thin slices of my pepper. Again, going through the inner membrane of the pepper. I'm not cutting through the outside skin because it's waxy. And honestly, this knife I'm holding right now, I have not sharpened in a long time. So by cutting through the inside, makes things a little bit easier for yourself. Put that in my mise en place cup. Next, we're going to do some cucumber. So this is an English cucumber. They generally come with a plastic wrapping on them. I like these more than a regular cucumber for something like this because the seeds are not as soft as a regular cucumber. Because this is so long, I'm going to cut this into some smaller sections that are more easy for me to manage. And just like my carrot, I'm going to stand this up on its side, make some nice thin planks out of that cucumber. And if, holding it up on its side is too wobbly, you can always start with that first slice and then lay it on its side. But the cucumber is really soft to cut through, so it's usually not too much of a problem. Now that we have our beautiful thin planks of our cucumber, just like our carrot, I'm going to cut this into some thin sticks, using my knuckle as my guide. So we have our beautiful julienne cucumber. And you don't want to make these longer than the length of your spring roll. That is something to keep in mind. All of my stuff is about the same length. Very important to keep in mind when you're cutting stuff for your spring rolls. Next, we're going to, some fruit in there. Wow, I can't talk anymore, you guys. We're going to throw a couple strawberries in there. So just like my tomato, I like to start by taking that stem off because it's in my way and I don't want to deal with it. Now, there's a few ways to take the hull out of a strawberry. Something that I do, if it's like nice and flat on top, is I will just cut a very thin kind of slice out of the top of the strawberry. That gives you a nice flat surface. The downside is you do get a little bit of food waste this way. So another method that you could use is with a paring knife. You're going to stick that into the top of your strawberry at an angle, and then using a sawing motion, keeping the tip angled towards the center of the strawberry, you are going to go around in a circle. And once you complete that circle, you can just pop that tip right out. We get a lot less food waste this way. So both ways work. This one's a little bit quicker. With our strawberries, I like to just cut it with a paring knife because they're small. We're just, again, gonna make some nice thin pieces of strawberry. And you'll notice when I slice, I kind of knock that piece over. I'm gonna try to keep these strawberries together so I can like fan them out nicely in my spring roll. So again, I'm just gonna slice this thin, kind of using my index finger after each slice to keep this together. And then that is going to go into my bowl. Next thing we're going to do, and last thing we're going to do, is an avocado. So with my avocado, there's a big pit on the inside. We're not going to cut through that. So I'm going to start cutting through my avocado. I've hit the pit. So now what I do is I just rotate this around my blade until I reach a full circle. From here, I can twist the blade or twist the avocado to pop that open. To get the blade or to get the pit out, I'm going to use the heel of my knife to kind of pop that onto the pit, give it a tap to make sure it's nice and in there. And then I'm going to twist this. Sometimes you break your pit, so you just have to start over. I'm going to twist this so that the pit comes out. To get rid of the pit, you just pinch on your blade and push downwards, and that should pop right off. Now for my avocado, instead of scooping it out with a spoon, what I like to do is slice it in half and just peel off that skin. I find this a little bit easier. And again, less food waste this way. So with my avocado, I'm just going to slice this thin, again, trying to keep those pieces together so I can fan them out and make them look pretty. So when we do something like this, you know, we can kind of fan that out, have a nice, like, pretty looking piece of avocado. So I have everything prepped and ready to go. I have my herbs, you know, I have everything in containers. Off to the side up here, I have a shallow dish with some water in it, and we're gonna go ahead and make a couple spring rolls in our last few minutes of this demo. Another thing that I have already is some rice noodles. These were just soaking in hot water for a few minutes, drained and mixed and rinsed with cold water. I also have a couple shrimp that I have cooked already. So I'm actually going to very thinly slice these shrimp. I'm just going to slice them in half so that they are ready to go. I'm just going to cut them down in half. So I have 2 thinner pieces of shrimp. So I have my shrimp ready to go. I'm just going to set this off to the side. So let's make our spring rolls. We have our rice paper. I think it's 7 or 8 inch in size. You're going to submerge that in your water, ideally slightly warm water, just for a few seconds. It doesn't need to be completely soft. You just want it to soften a little bit. So you can see this still, you know, is holding its shape. It's not super soft, but as it sits on my cutting board, it will continue to absorb that liquid. Now, because this is clear, I want to make a pretty presentation. So I'm going to kind of lay these shrimp down nicely like this in the center, but slightly towards me on my circle. And then I will lay, you know, just some vegetables on top. Maybe I'll just do carrots and cucumber on this one. I love herbs on here. I just have some basil, some mint. Like, I just kind of go crazy with herbs. I love it so much on my spring rolls. I'm going to throw in a little piece of cilantro. Why not? And then I'm going to top this all off just with some rice noodles. Pro tip with the rice noodles, cut them in half, either before or after cooking, so they're easier to separate. Now from here, what I'm going to do is, this paper is much softer now. I'm going to fold it up, kind of using my fingers to keep everything in place. I'm going to fold in the sides like a burrito, and then we just continue rolling. And we can see that pretty shrimp on top. It's a really, nice display. And I'll do another vegetarian one with the strawberries. And then we will check on our chicken, which I believe is done. And then we will be all set. So this recipe also can use tofu if you want to. We can keep these vegetarian. These are just a great way to get some fun, vegetables in. So let's do one with strawberries. And the reason I kept these together is I can fan these out just like this so that they look pretty on the other side. I'm also going to add in my avocado. Let's go with some basil. So we got strawberry, avocado, and basil. Makes a great salad, also makes a great spring roll. And I'm just going to top that with some rice noodles. And again, to roll, we pull up the bottom, fold that over everything, keeping it contained, fold in the sides, and then just continue to roll. So we have our strawberry basil vegetarian version, our version with some shrimp. Looks nice because it's see-through. It's beautiful on the other side. And let me just show you how our chicken is doing. So for our chicken, we can see that we don't get a ton of brown color on the chicken this way. If you want to brown it up, you could always put it under the broiler, but we can see that our potatoes, our vegetables are nice and browned. Check out this piece of cauliflower, and lovely. And that is all I have for you all today. I think we have some wrap-up slides that we can show you all.
Emily, I just have to say, everyone is commenting in the chat about how beautiful your spring rolls look. They are excited. If they aren't making them now, they're excited to try them. I mentioned it's such a fun thing to do as like a party thing, or like friends and family get together, have everybody roll their own rolls. It's so great because there's so many fun, healthy fruits and veggies.
Yes, spring roll parties are the best, and you just end up eating a lot of vegetables at the very end.
Exactly. Yeah, so you want to wrap it up, Emily?
Yeah, so for our wrap up, again, having confidence in the kitchen allows you to have more fun. You kind of saw Heather and I laughing with each other. Being in the kitchen, being around knives, like once you're more comfortable, it's less stress. You can enjoy cooking, you can be safe, and it'll allow you to add more nutrition to your meals because now you're confident in, cutting up any piece of produce your way. And this will also help you to save money when you can process ingredients on your own. And I believe the next slide is some pictures of our final product. This is actually from last week. That's why my Nook Jum has green pepper in it instead of red. But you can see we've incorporated so many vegetables in these different meals that we were able to make today. And they look beautiful, if I do say so myself. So I think I went over time. I think we have a few minutes for a couple questions.
Yeah, so I think we answered everything, but if anybody has anything else they want to add, last minute, let's see.
And Heather, while you are looking for some of those questions, I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here with some of those beautiful pictures that were coming.
Oh my gosh.
Lovely presentation,
That's
y'all.
great.
Please make sure to tag us if you are a social person and are posting onto social media. Tag us at Health Meets Food. It will have the little wheel, green wheel and fork icon on Instagram as well as Facebook. Health Meets Food, all one word, all lowercase. Beautiful job, y'all. And I just have to say, I am so happy to have spent the last couple of hours with Emily and Heather showing us some of these fantastic ingredients, as well as skills. I think that chicken, I know there were so many great comments on breaking down chicken. It's something that oftentimes folks don't necessarily do, particularly when it is still raw. Any last minute questions, Heather, that you saw come through the chat?
Well, we do have a question about a best way to quickly prep tofu for a spring roll. My answer was going to be, I usually just press it, do a salt and pepper, give it a nice sear, and then cut it into little planks. But Emily, do you have any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, you can do a quick press on tofu. I know the recipe calls for it to be cooked in a pan. Usually when I do tofu for spring rolls, I'll do like a little bit of a glaze on it, like with some like hoisin sauce or something maybe. And I actually bake it in the oven, so I don't have to worry about pressing it as much. And a quick tip for tofu, if you need to get all of the moisture out, if you freeze your tofu and then thaw it, that tofu just like expels all of the moisture. You can just kind of squeeze it like a sponge. All of that liquid will come out. And that's a nice trick if you want to get your tofu really dry so that you can get it nice and crispy in your pan.
Awesome. I love that. Tofu is such a great option, especially if you aren't going to the grocery store very frequently. It's something that you can keep in the back of your fridge.
I always have tofu in my fridge. It's great.
Thank you all so much. We're going to take about a 15-minute break. Feel free to join the breakout sessions. I just posted the link in the chat. If you want to join that other meeting to connect with your colleagues, we'll come back here at 1:35 for our next session. Really interesting talks this afternoon, all on food and culture. Regarding a few different industries. So we will see you at 1:35. Feel free to come back from those breakout rooms, or if you want to just hang out and we'll get started, feel free to take a little cat nap, get yourself some more coffee, or as Dr. Harlan always likes to say, make yourself that peanut butter and jelly sandwich. 2 points on the Mediterranean diet for a pretty quick lunch. We'll be back with y'all shortly. Thank you, Ellen and Heather. Really phenomenal job.
Thank you.